The bunker was a tomb long before its occupant accepted death. By April 27, 1945, the Führer bunker, buried 9 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, had become the last sovereign territory of the Third Reich. Above ground, Soviet artillery pounded the city into dust. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was now measured in city blocks, then streets, then meters. And in those final 72 hours, as the Red Army closed like a vice around the government quarter, Adolf Hitler, the man who had reshaped Europe through violence and will, began his final descent into a carefully choreographed obliteration. But these were not hours of reflection or repentance. They were hours of delusion, rage, and an almost theatrical commitment to a narrative Hitler had been writing since long before the war began. That betrayal, not failure, would be his epitaph. The psyche of a dictator does not bend toward humility when confronted with annihilation. It fractures into blame, paranoia, and the desperate need to control the final scene. The Führer bunker was never designed to be pleasant. Constructed in 2 phases between 1943 and 1944, it was a utilitarian maze of concrete and steel, 18 cramped rooms divided between an upper and lower level, connected by a spiral staircase. Ventilation was poor. The air was stale, recycled, suffocating. Dim electric lights flickered overhead. The smell of mildew mixed with unwashed bodies, diesel fuel, and decay. Outside, Berlin burned. Inside, the remnants of Nazi leadership shuffled through narrow corridors like ghosts trapped in a purgatory of their own making. Hitler's physical deterioration was startling. Witnesses described a man hunched and trembling, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, likely the result of Parkinson's disease, though some historians suggest the tremors were exacerbated by years of drug dependency. Dr. Theodor Morell, Hitler's personal physician, had been injecting him with a cocktail of substances for years: amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, testosterone, and even compounds derived from animal glands. But April 1945, Morell had been dismissed, but the damage was irreversible. Hitler's eyes were bloodshot and glassy. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor. He moved slowly, dragging his feet, one hand perpetually pressed against the cold concrete wall for balance. Yet his mind, warped, delusional, but still sharp, remained fixed on the idea that salvation was possible. Even as Soviet shells shook dust from the ceiling, Hitler pored over maps in the map room, moving phantom armies with trembling fingers. Divisions that existed only on paper were ordered to counterattack. Generals who tried to explain the impossibility of his commands were met with screaming fury or cold dismissal. Reality had become optional. The Führer had spent years constructing a reality through propaganda, terror, and sheer force of will. Now, in his final hours, he retreated fully into that constructed world. On the evening of April 27th, Hitler received news that shattered even his carefully maintained illusions. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsfuhrer SS, architect of the Holocaust, and one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy, had attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte. The betrayal was reported by the BBC and picked up by German intelligence. When Hitler learned of it, witnesses described a reaction of volcanic rage. He screamed until his voice cracked. He accused Himmler of being the most faithless traitor in history. Spittle flew from his lips. His face turned crimson. For a man whose entire ideology rested on loyalty, hierarchy, and racial destiny, Himmler's treachery was not merely a political betrayal, it was a metaphysical wound. This was the psychology of a dictator in extremis, unable to process failure as systemic, only as personal. The Reich had not been defeated by superior strategy, resources, or ideology. It had been stabbed in the back. The same narrative Hitler had weaponized after World War I was now the story he told himself in the final act. Himmler, Goering, the generals, the German people themselves, all had failed him, not the other way around. Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison officer and Eva Braun's brother-in-law, was arrested the same night. He had been found attempting to flee Berlin in civilian clothes, drunk and carrying foreign currency. Hitler ordered him stripped of rank and executed. Fegelein was dragged into the Chancellery Garden and shot. It was a small, personal vengeance, a dictator reasserting control over the only thing he still commanded: life and death within arm's reach. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew more surreal. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, maintained an eerie composure. She had arrived in Berlin voluntarily on April 15th, refusing Hitler's orders to leave.
Now she spent her time in her small room, writing letters, listening to records, and applying makeup as if preparing for a performance. Others drank heavily. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had moved his entire family into the bunker, his wife Magda and their 6 children. The children played in the corridors, unaware that their parents had already decided their fate.
By April 28th, the illusion of command had completely dissolved, but the rituals of power remained. Hitler still held his military conferences, gathering the remaining officers in the cramped map room where the walls seemed to press inward with each passing hour. But the discussions had become a grotesque pantomime. Generals reported on units that no longer existed. Orders were issued to divisions that had been annihilated days earlier. The map itself, covered in colored pins and penciled arrows, represented a fiction so elaborate that even some of the participants struggled to maintain the charade. Yet no one dared state the obvious. Berlin would fall within days, perhaps hours, and there was no escape. The Soviet advance had reached a mathematical inevitability. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces were pushing from the north, Marshal Ivan Konev from the south. They had encircled the city completely by April 25th, and now they were fighting block by block, building by building toward the government quarter. The Red Army had learned urban warfare the hard way at Stalingrad, at Königsberg, and they applied those lessons with ruthless efficiency. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead. Tank shells punched through walls. Flamethrowers cleared entire buildings. The Germans defending the city were a desperate patchwork. Exhausted Wehrmacht regulars, fanatical SS units, old men from the Volkssturm, and boys from the Hitler Youth, some barely 15 years old, clutching Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons they barely knew how to fire. Inside the bunker, the psychological pressure became unbearable. Sleep was impossible. The constant percussion of artillery created a rhythm of dread. Dust drifted down from the ceiling with each impact. The lights flickered. Conversations were punctuated by explosions close enough to rattle teeth. And beneath it all was the knowledge, unspoken but universal, that capture by the Soviets meant something worse than death. The Red Army had discovered the concentration camps. They had seen Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka. Soviet soldiers advancing on Berlin were not coming as liberators. They were coming as avengers. Hitler understood this completely. His entire ideology had been predicated on a racial war of annihilation, and he knew the Soviets would respond in kind. The prospect of being paraded through Moscow in a cage, put on trial, or worse, displayed as a broken, humiliated old man was intolerable. For a dictator whose power had always rested on image, spectacle, and the projection of invincibility, such an end was unthinkable. Death, therefore, had to be controlled. It had to be deliberate, staged, final. On the afternoon of April 28th, Hitler learned that Benito Mussolini, his ideological ally and fellow fascist dictator, had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. Mussolini's body, along with his mistress Clara Petacci, had been hung upside down from a metal girder at a gas station in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. Crowds had gathered to spit on the corpses, throw stones, mutilate them. The images were already spreading through the international press. The effect on Hitler was immediate and profound. He became obsessed with the details. How had Mussolini been caught? How had he died? What had they done to his body? He questioned everyone who might have information. The idea of his own corpse subjected to such desecration, photographed, mocked, violated, became a fixation. He gave explicit orders. Upon his death, his body was to be burned completely. Nothing was to remain. No relics, no grave, no possibility of spectacle. This was not mere vanity. It was the final act of a man who had spent his entire political life understanding the power of symbols. Hitler had risen to power through the manipulation of imagery, mythology, and mass psychology. The Nuremberg rallies, the torchlit processions, the carefully staged photographs, all of it had been designed to create an aura of inevitability and superhuman will. Even in death, he would deny his enemies the symbolic victory of his broken body. That same evening, Hitler made the decision to marry Eva Braun. The ceremony was brief, absurd, almost comical in its bureaucratic formality. A city official named Walter Wagner, dragged from a Volkssturm unit defending a nearby street, was brought into the bunker to officiate. He still wore his uniform and carried his weapon. The ceremony took place in the map room, now serving as an improvised chapel. Goebbels and Martin Bormann served as witnesses. Eva Braun signed the marriage certificate as Eva B. before catching herself and scratching it out to write Eva Hitler, née Braun. She had waited 16 years for this moment, and it had arrived 36 hours before her death.
The marriage was not sentimental, it was transactional, symbolic, a final gesture of loyalty and control. Eva had chosen to stay. She had refused every opportunity to leave Berlin, and Hitler in turn granted her the only thing he could still offer, his name. In the distorted logic of the bunker, this was a love story. In reality, it was the final contractual arrangement between two people trapped in a suicide pact. After the ceremony, Hitler retired to a small side room with his secretary, Traudle Junge, to dictate his last will and testament. The document is one of the most revealing psychological artifacts of the Nazi collapse. It is not a confession. There is no remorse, no acknowledgement of the millions dead, the cities destroyed, the civilization shattered. Instead, it is a manifesto of blame. Hitler begins by asserting that he never wanted war, that it was forced upon him by international Jewry. He expels Goering and Himmler from the Nazi Party for their betrayals. He appoints Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor, and he urges the German people to continue the struggle, to uphold the racial laws, and to resist the poisoning of the blood. The testament is a masterpiece of self-deception and projection. Even at the end, surrounded by ruin entirely of his own creation, Hitler cast himself as the victim. The dictator's final words were not an apology to history. They were an indictment of everyone but himself.
April 29th, 1945. The second to last day of Adolf Hitler's life. The air in the bunker had become almost unbreathable. The ventilation system, never adequate, now struggled against the smoke and dust pouring in from above. Berlin was an inferno. The Soviets had reached the Reichstag, less than 300 meters from the Chancellery. Street fighting raged in the Tiergarten. Every few minutes the bunker shuddered from impact so close that chunks of concrete flaked from the ceiling. The lights went out repeatedly, plunging the corridors into total darkness before the backup generators kicked in with a sputtering hum. In those moments of blackness, the only sounds were labored breathing, distant explosions, and the occasional whimper of Goebbels' children sleeping fitfully in their shared room. Hitler spent much of the day in his private quarters with Eva. Witnesses reported hearing muffled conversations, but the content remains unknown. What is known is that he was making final preparations. He tested the cyanide capsules that had been provided by SS physician Ludwig Stumpfegger, capsules originally intended for Himmler's use, a bitter irony given the recent betrayal. Hitler ordered one capsule tested on his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. The dog was brought to a small washroom. Stumpfegger forced the capsule into her mouth and crushed it. Blondie convulsed and died within seconds. Hitler did not witness the act directly, but he was informed immediately. He showed no visible emotion, though others noted he avoided the room where the dog's body lay for the remainder of the day. The testing of the poison was not paranoia, it was method. Hitler trusted nothing and no one at this point, not even the chemicals that would end his life. The capsules had come through SS channels, and Himmler's betrayal had poisoned every link in that chain of command. What if the capsules were fake? What if they had been replaced with sedatives, designed to render him unconscious so he could be captured alive? The dictator who had built an empire on ruthless control could not surrender control even of his own death. Every detail had to be verified, tested, assured. On the evening of April 29th, Hitler held what would be his final meeting with his inner circle. Goebbels was there, fervent and pale, his voice hoarse from days of chain-smoking and stress. Bormann, the shadowy party secretary, stood in the corner, ever calculating. General William Bergdorf and General Hans Krebs, both career officers now trapped in a Wagnerian endgame, presented the military situation with the grim professionalism of men describing an autopsy. The Soviets had taken the Moltke Bridge. They were in the subway tunnels. They had artillery positions with direct line of sight to the Chancellery entrance. Relief was impossible. Wenck's 12th Army, which Hitler had been counting on for days, had been stopped cold southwest of the city. There would be no breakout. There would be no miracle. Hitler listened in silence, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the map as if sheer willpower might rearrange the colored pins. When the briefing ended, he dismissed everyone except Goebbels. What passed between them in that private moment is speculation, but the outcome is fact. Goebbels would remain in the bunker with his family. He would not flee. He would not surrender. He and his wife Magda had already made the decision to kill their 6 children and then themselves. It was a pact forged in fanaticism and despair, a final demonstration of loyalty not to Germany, but to Hitler personally, and to the ideology they had built their lives around. This is the darkest edge of totalitarian psychology, the willingness to murder one's own children rather than allow them to live in a world where the ideology has failed. For Magda Goebbels, the choice was framed as mercy. She wrote letters to her son from a previous marriage, explaining that life in a post-Nazi world would not be worth living for her children, that they were too pure, too indoctrinated, too identified with the Reich to survive its collapse. It was a grotesque inversion of maternal love, killing as an act of protection, but it was also the logical endpoint of a worldview that placed ideological purity above human life. As night fell on April 29th, the
the bunker's inhabitants began to fracture into factions. Some, like Bormann, still plotted escape routes, whispering about tunnels and disguises. Others drank themselves into oblivion. The secretaries huddled together, crying quietly. The guards stood at their posts, expressless, perhaps already mentally rehearsing the stories that would tell Soviet interrogators. Hitler himself withdrew almost completely. He ate little, some soup, a piece of bread. He refused alcohol. He sat for long periods in silence, staring at the blank concrete wall of his small room. But there was one final piece of business. Late that night, Hitler summoned Traudl Junge again to dictate an addendum to his will, a personal statement. In it, he explained his decision to marry Eva Braun and his decision to die in Berlin rather than fall into enemy hands. The language was cold, bureaucratic, almost clerical. There was no poetry, no grand rhetoric, just the mechanical documentation of a suicide announced in advance. He stated clearly that both he and his wife would take their own lives, and that their bodies were to be burned. He wanted no grave, no shrine, no place for pilgrims or enemies to visit. This obsession with erasure speaks volumes. Hitler had spent his political career constructing a mythology around death, the martyrs of the beer hall putsch, the cult of the fallen soldier, the eternal flame. He understood the power of graves and relics, and now, facing his own end, he sought to deny that power to both his followers and his enemies. He would not become a shrine. He would not become evidence. He would become ash and rumor. The dictator's final hours were not spent in reflection or reconciliation. They were spent micromanaging his own annihilation, controlling the narrative even as the walls caved in. This is the core pathology of authoritarianism at the individual level, the inability to accept reality, the compulsion to dominate every variable, the elevation of control above survival itself. And as April 30th dawned, though no one in the bunker could see the sun, Hitler prepared for the final act.
April 30th, 1945. The last day. The morning arrived without fanfare. There was no dawn in the bunker, no transition from night to day, only the unbroken artificial twilight of dim bulbs and the relentless percussion of Soviet artillery growing closer by the hour. By mid-morning, the Red Army had advanced to within 200 meters of the Reich Chancellery. Soviet infantry were moving through the shattered halls of the Reichstag, fighting floor by floor, room by room. Machine gun fire echoed through the government quarter. The smell of smoke and cordite seeped into the bunker's ventilation shafts. Time had run out. Hitler rose late, around 10 in the morning. He dressed carefully in his uniform, cleaned and pressed despite everything, a final assertion of order against encroaching chaos. His movements were slow, deliberate. He summoned his valet, Heinz Linge, and his SS adjutant, Otto Günsche, and gave them explicit, repeated instructions. After his death, their bodies, his and Eva's, were to be carried up to the Chancellery Garden, doused in gasoline, and burned until nothing recognizable remained. He made them repeat the orders back to him. He asked if they understood. They confirmed. He asked again. The repetition was not senility. It was the compulsion of a man who had controlled millions, and now could control only this. Around noon, Hitler emerged from his private quarters and walked slowly through the bunker corridor. He shook hands with the remaining staff, secretaries, guards, adjutants, officers. His hand was cold and damp. His grip was weak. He said very little, only a few mumbled words of thanks or farewell. Some of those present later described his eyes as empty, distant, already gone. Others said they saw a flicker of relief, as if a great burden was about to be lifted. He moved mechanically, going through the motions of a ritual he had clearly rehearsed in his mind many times. Eva Braun appeared beside him, composed and almost serene. She wore a blue dress with white trim, her favorite. She had done her hair and makeup. She smiled faintly at some of the secretaries, embraced a few, and whispered quiet goodbyes. There was something surreal, almost theatrical about her demeanor. She had lived in Hitler's shadow for 16 years, largely hidden from the public, denied recognition, kept as a secret. Now, in the final hours, she had his name and his undivided attention. She would die as his wife. For Eva, this may have felt like a kind of victory. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva withdrew into his private study. The door closed. Outside, the remaining occupants of the bunker waited in tense silence. Bormann paced. Goebbels sat rigidly, staring at nothing. The guards stood at attention. The secretaries clutched each other. Minutes passed. Then, around 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot cracked through the heavy air of the bunker. Linge and Günsche waited a few moments, protocol perhaps, or simply shock, before entering the room. What they found was a scene staged with meticulous intent. Hitler sat slumped on a small sofa, a bullet wound to his right temple, a Walter PPK 7.65mm pistol on the floor near his right hand. Blood had run down his face and soaked into the upholstery. Eva sat beside him, her body leaning slightly away, no visible wounds. The smell of bitter almonds, cyanide, hung in the air. She had bitten into a capsule. He had used both poison and the gun, unwilling to trust either method alone. It was a double suicide executed with German precision. Even in death, Hitler had left nothing to chance. The cyanide ensured that if the gunshot somehow failed, he would still die. The gunshot ensured that there would be no possibility of recovery, no chance of resuscitation, no scenario in which he could be dragged unconscious into Soviet hands. Control, maintained to the very last synapse. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and carried up the emergency exit staircase into the Chancellery Garden. The garden was a moonscape of craters, rubble, and twisted metal. Soviet shells were still landing sporadically. Linga, Gunsha, and several others laid the bodies in a shallow depression, doused them with gasoline from jerry cans stored in the bunker, and set them alight. The fire caught quickly, fed by the fuel and the dry fabric of the blankets. Black smoke rose into the gray Berlin sky, mingling with the smoke from 1,000 other fires burning across the city. The cremation was incomplete. The fire burned for hours, but there was not enough gasoline, and the shelling made it too dangerous to tend the flames properly. By the time the fire died down, the bodies were charred beyond recognition but not fully consumed. Bone fragments, pieces of skull, teeth, these remained. Later, Soviet intelligence units would recover these remains, conduct forensic analysis, and confirm the identities through dental records. But in the moment, to those who stood watching, it was enough. The Führer was gone. Inside the bunker, the reaction was muted. There was no wailing, no dramatic collapse. Bormann assumed command of what remained and immediately drafted a message to Admiral Donitz, informing him of Hitler's death and his succession as Reich president. But the message was clinical, procedural. The mood was one of exhausted finality, not grief. These were people who had long since passed through denial and anger and bargaining. They had arrived at acceptance, or perhaps simply numbness. That evening, Joseph and Magda Goebbels carried out their own plan. Magda crushed cyanide capsules into the mounts of her 6 children, one by one, as they lay sedated in their bunk beds. Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, Heide, ages ranging from 4 to 12, died without waking. Afterwards, Joseph and Magda walked up into the garden. Goebbels shot his wife, then himself. Their bodies were also burned, though far less thoroughly than Hitler's. By May 2nd, the remaining bunker occupants had either fled, surrendered, or committed suicide. Bormann attempted to escape through the subway tunnels and likely died in the attempt, though his fate remained uncertain for decades. General Krebs negotiated briefly with the Soviets, then shot himself. The guards and secretaries surrendered. Trottel Julge survived and would later write one of the most detailed accounts of Hitler's final days. When Soviet soldiers finally stormed the bunker, they found a scene of eerie desolation. Papers scattered across floors, half-eaten meals on tables, children's toys in the corridor, the smell of death and gasoline. They photographed everything, collected documents, and began the process of piecing together what had happened in those final 72 hours. But the question that haunts history is not what happened. The forensic details are well documented. The question is why. Why did Hitler choose death over surrender? Why did he burn his body? Why did Goebbels murder his children? Why did so many follow their leader into oblivion rather than step into the future? The answer lies in the psychology of totalitarianism itself. For Hitler, surrender was not merely defeat, it was existential erasure. His entire identity was fused with his role as Führer, with the mythology of will and destiny he had constructed. To live as a prisoner, to be judged, to be stripped of power and spectacle, would be to confront the hollowness of the core of that identity. Death was not an escape, it was the final assertion of control in a world that had slipped entirely beyond his grasp. And so, in a bunker 9 meters below a burning city, Adolf Hitler ended his life the way he had lived it, staging a spectacle, controlling the narrative, and leaving behind ash, ruins, and the echo of a question that history will never stop asking. How did it come to this?